Welcome back to Cake with It, and for today's episode, may the cake be with you. A Star Wars themed R2-D2 cake. First, we simple syrup our cakes. And because it's Star Wars, we have our own special guest, Darth Vader. And no, we're not making Darth Vader as a cake.
Your skills are complete. You
Oh.
have learned much here.
I still love you.
What is that needed?
We are making R2-D2 as a cake. I baked 4 of my Devil's Food chocolate cake, and you can find the recipe on my website. And then I stacked them with vanilla buttercream. And you repeat that with every layer, and you could cut them in half or you could leave them as whole. Next, I begin to carve out the edges of my cake so that it's smooth and evenly, and you do that after you refrigerate it. I'm also going to start carving the dome from my cake because R2-D2 has a round top head, so I'm going to shape my cake that way. And the cake fell in the trash. Not the cake, but the cake scraps fell right into the trash. I always have a trash bowl ready for anyone who helps out. And Alex, weren't you so disappointed?
Yep.
That cake fell right in the trash, and we just stared at it like it was the end of the world. Next, I realized that it's not dome enough, and I don't want to carve off too much of the cake, so I add buttercream and cake scraps on top to shape it into a dome-like figure. And I'm going to crumb coat the whole thing. Yes, crumb coat. Then refrigerate, and then go back and do a final coat. But the most important part is to work slow and to make sure you keep the dome shape on the cake for R2-D2. And you can use a mix of offset spatula, a ruler, whatever makes it easier for you to spread the buttercream. And you know what time is it?
There is no escape.
It is chill time.
It is useless to resist.
It is chill time.
Release your anger.
He's never gonna shut up, is he? Chill time.
Release your anger.
I roll out some fondant using cornstarch. I don't like using powdered sugar. To about 18 inches long, so you want to measure your R2-D2, and then I trim it precisely, and I use my rolling pin to wrap around it and cover the cake with the fondant. It takes practice, but you'll get used to it. I then use my X-Acto knife to cut off any extra fondant and use my fondant smoother to smooth out as much of the fondant as I can. Then I grab my fondant tool and use that to flatten the bottom part, and then I use my fingers to finish off what the tool couldn't do, and I use my X-Acto knife to carve out any excess fondant. I use my trusty ruler to make sure I make an even line around the top of the cake, and then I go ahead and cut it to make sure it's nice and straight. I grab black fondant, white fondant, and I tint it with a little bit of black food coloring. I roll it out and I cover the top of R2-D2's head. Then I use my X-Acto knife and draw a line around the top as a guide, and then I go back and carve it off to make sure it fits R2-D2's head. Then after that, I use a fondant smoother to smooth out the top. Now, to smooth out any imperfection, I grab fondant and you put water in it and you work it until it becomes a paste. And I use that to fill in any cracks on my cake. I use silver food coloring and airbrush the cake, and you have to do 2 layers of it. And then I realize it's too small. This was bad. I realize it's too small. R2-D2 is taller, but I always have a trick up my sleeve. And I had an extra scrap of cake. So that cake I'm going to add back to the bottom and make R2-D2 taller. Although it's not going to be slimmer because this cake is for my nephew's birthday party and I'm feeding a whole army of people. So this R2-D2 is a little bit on the chubby side. Ain't nothing wrong with that. It's what's on the inside that counts. And that's chocolate cake. So I grab my extra cake and I buttercream it. So now I'm going to add straws. I don't want to use cake dowels. I'll just use straws. And I'll stick them in the cake and trim any extra pieces. I then cut off a piece of cardboard to fit on top of the cake. And then I roll out fondant exactly to fit the edges of the cake and then smooth it out with my fondant smoother and trim the bottom piece. Next, I take away the cardboard to reveal how much fondant I'm going to have to trim off, and I begin to use my X-Acto knife to trim off around the cake so I know exactly how much I need to trim. Then I put the top of the cake on top of the base, and I grab extra fondant just to cover around the opening with the cardboard, and I use my fondant smoother to smooth it out. I make Rice Krispie cereal, and you could find any recipe online would work. I keep it simple, just marshmallow and Rice Krispie, and I mix it with a glove that's well greased or else it will be a mess. Next, I'm gonna form his arms or legs. I think they're arms. And I grab a Rice Krispie treat and I start shaping it into a log. And then I create the ridges and edges around the edge and smooth out the top part. And make sure I measure it so it's precise and it's not off from the actual cake. and R2-D2 blue. That's not a color. Apparently I made a color up and it's R2-D2 blue. Yeah, that's my sketch for the cake. And another thing I realized, pal, is that the silver line was way too thin. So I went back and added another strip and then colored it silver so it would blend in and make the bottom parts bigger. It's a big process, I'm telling you. I cut a 1/4 inch strip and use it to cover this seam. Then I roll out some more R2-D2 blue and I use a lid as my guide and I cut around with the X-Acto knife. And I'm gonna use 2 different size cookie cutters, one slightly smaller. I'm gonna cut 2 holes in the center of that round one, and then I'll take the ring out and I'll cut 6 even slices from the outer ring. And next I'm going to place the center ring on top of R2-D2's head, and then I'll distribute those 6 pieces, leaving a gap in between all around R2-D2. And I also cut rectangles and I'm going to put those around R2-D2's head. The next one is pretty much simple, just follow along in the screen. And I want to create wires, so I'm going to grab some tan colored fondant and I'm going to roll it. I'm going to use floor wire to insert it into it, and then it's flexible, and I'm going to stick those underneath R2-D2's feet because he has wires sticking out, and then you could shape it the way you want it because of the wire that's in it. And I'm going to do that to both sides. Next, I'm going to create the bottom part that R2-D2 has. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but you could use a stencil and cut it out and then trace it, but for this I freehand everything. So just pretty much you can tell, you roll it out as a rectangle, and then after that you trim off a bit from the edges and then trim off from the center. And to make sure you have a nice clean straight line, always use a ruler. And after that I'm gonna have to do it twice because he has one on the top and one towards the bottom. Next I'm gonna put a small strip on the top and then the 2 pieces on the bottom. I'm going to create the vent he has in the bottom, and I don't have an oval cutter, so I'm going to use 2 round cookie cutters and my X-Acto knife to shape it into an oval, one on the top, one in the bottom, and then we're going to put that under the bottom of those 2 switches on R2-D2. To create the little buttons, pretty much simple. Then I use my fondant tool to create lines. Then I use toothpicks to glue and place the red button on the bottom of R2-D2's eye, and use water. I use the same silver food coloring that I use on the airbrush, but now I'm going to use a brush and color in all of R2-D2's little vents on the top. I add little pieces of fondant to R2-D2, and I'm going to create the little vent or button heads on the bottom. So I'm going to use a round cookie cutter and stab into the cake, peel off the first layer, add a small layer, and then add a fondant shaped button. And now for the best part, we're going to cut R2-D2 open. Yes, we're going to cut him open, and like I said, what matters is on the inside, and he is dark chocolate and he tastes delicious. So I hope you enjoyed my Star Wars theme video. So if you liked it, make sure you like and make sure you subscribe. Make sure you like, subscribe, turn on the bell post notification. I'm just gonna write here.
You are beaten. It is useless to resist.
He won't shut up.